Okay, and welcome to the February edition of the Cinetopia podcast. I'm Amanda Rogers, co-founder of Cinetopia, and I'm here with Jim, co-producer of the show. Jim, how are you?
I'm good, Amanda. Thank you.
Great. And Steph as well, one of our regulars. Steph, welcome back, and looking forward to chatting with you. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you, Amanda. Yourself?
Not too bad. I'm in the midst of enjoying the snow and also working very hard on an edit. So it's good weather for staying indoors and staying focused. Anyway, on this podcast today, we're going to review 4 films. Netflix version of a lockdown film, Malcolm and Marie, which is directed by Sam Levinson. Also, The Mauritanian, which is directed by Scottish director Kevin Macdonald. It will actually be at Glasgow Film Festival online, and then for wider release pretty soon. And then also we're going to be reviewing Bryan Fogel's new documentary, The Dissident, which premiered at Sundance last year, but will also be at the Glasgow Film Festival. And finally, we're reviewing the new documentary by Gianfranco Rosi, Notturno. Premiered originally at Venice Film Festival. It was at London Film Festival, but it will be out on wider release during the month. So Jim also interviewed Alex Camilleri, the director of Luzzu, which premiered at Sundance, and Jim was part of the Sundance, was part of the press screenings of that. So we're going to hear a little bit about that as well. And Betty, our regular contributor and sometimes podcast contributor as well, was also at Rotterdam online. So she's going to give us a little segment about that experience. And that's all for February, but it's proving to be quite exciting. So just a little bit of news from Cinetopia. We're really excited to announce that we have been chosen to be part of the Creative Informatics Resident Entrepreneur Program. So that allows us to kind of start what we're trying to do with this virtual community hub. I think a few months ago, you might have seen that we were putting out a survey for filmmakers and people within the film industry to let us know what kind of thing they'd like to see in a hub. So I always welcome your recommendations or just any interest in what we're doing in the behind the scenes on that. We'll announce more stuff as the months go by, and very much looking forward to sharing when we can start the Cinescapes project that we talked a lot about as well. But, the lockdown is continuing to happen. So we're just optimistic, but working behind the scenes on that. But as I mentioned, Jim, you were part of the Sundance press. So you got to attend the festival in a remote fashion. Do you have any feedback on that experience?
I think some people, when they react to Sundance films, are maybe a bit over the top, and I've blamed that on the Thin Mountaineer in Utah before, but I don't think that can be blamed this time. It was good though. It was good. I did Sundance last year, but I did it like I was ahead of my time. You see, right? I did it remotely there. Basically, I used the press accreditation to chase up screeners, and I managed to see a bunch of films that way. This time it was all online, right? So the press and the public, same sort of ideal. It was just the press got it basically a day before, essentially, as a premiere. And overall it was pretty good. There were some pretty not good films in there, to be honest. But there were some that were excellent. There was Judas and the Black Messiah, was a very good one, which is going to come out quite soon, I think. It's one of these ones that's going to end up on HBO Max that we spoke about in the show before. Yeah. That was really good. Alex Camilleri's Luzzu, the director we're talking to in the interview later in the show, I think that was probably my favourite of the festival, about a Maltese fisherman. I'd definitely keep an eye out for that. It's really good. And there were a bunch I saw that were good. There were some that weren't so much. I'm not going to talk about them here because I don't see the point in kicking them further when in some cases I need to write a review where I'm not going to be praising them too much. But it was a good experience, and I quite like the idea. I'm getting used to the idea of virtual film festivals. Just kind of like, particularly when there's a lot of people that just buzz of activity online when somebody, a whole bunch of people have seen a film. It's not the same, but I'll take it for now.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one of the things with Sundance particularly is that were able to open it up it's always, I mean, isn't Sundance very much about the activation and being seen within the industry? And I mean, that's primary. Maybe the films aren't quite as good as other film festivals or whatnot, but it's kind of about that meeting place. But at least with this, you're not, of course, you're not waiting in line in the freezing cold, and and it's not about the cachet or something like that. So hopefully, that will continue to exist with other film festivals. I mean, I think the same case was with Rotterdam as well. Like, it much be nicer to have some in-person screenings and stuff. But we'll hear what Betty's take on that is later in the show. So the first film that we're going to review today is Malcolm and Marie, directed by Sam Levinson. It's currently on Netflix, so you can check it out there. So Steph, why don't you tell us a little bit about the film?
Okay, so it's the latest release from Sam Levinson, who I think a lot of people will know from his hit series Euphoria, which is, I think, going into its second season. He's had a few credits throughout the years. If anyone's seen any of his early work, he sort of jumps in between genres and kind of explores different terrain through all his filmmaking. And he goes into this one, in a way, kind of like a kitchen sink drama on screen. So we have John David Washington, that was kind of made a name for himself primarily this year through Nolan's Tenet. And we have Zendaya coming back again. She worked with Levinson as well in Euphoria as one of the stars of that show, and she's also quite big. I think within quite a lot of the new Spider-Man releases. So this is it's pretty much the tellings of an event unfolding within one kind of space, one house, over the course of an evening. And it starts when John David Washington's character Malcolm is coming back from a celebratory kind of premiere of his new film, which, up until he's returned home, has been very highly praised from the critics that were also attending the premiere. So it kind of fluctuates in between how Malcolm himself kind of perceives and has experienced the evening to how his partner Marie has kind of felt quite distanced from it, and it really unravels into how a lot of kind of kitchen sink dramas on film unravel. It goes into different avenues of power dynamics, and it addresses kind of a select few of major conflicts which kind of collide within the two characters. So it's pretty much an exploration of relationships in that, and not to give too much away, but it's very much one where you kind of, it's kind of, it's like a game of Wimbledon with this thing. You're going back and forward between these two characters' kind of feelings towards the relationship and their life as such, just now within Malcolm's career and outside of it, and how that's kind of affected them both.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's good to note that largely the film was obviously shot this year, right, during lockdown in one setting. So it's very much one location, two people, and an attempt to do something high production value, with a well-known director. So what did you guys think of the film? I'll save my points till afterwards.
I'll start off with the positives first. I think in terms of the way the film looks, I think they've done an extremely good job, particularly with even independent of the restrictions, it was made under the need to kind of like have a very, very scaled back crew and all the rest of it. I think they've done a pretty good job. I think it was shot on 35mm in black and white, and I think the decision to do that pays off. I think it's a very good looking film. I've got a lot of time for the performances, in the sense of what they make of what they've been given, and we're going to come back to that in a minute. I think it's I've not seen Euphoria. Is the which like Zendaya's won? I think it was an Emmy. She won an award for that. So my experience of her on film is pretty limited. So it's a far more interesting performance than I've seen from her in previous films, which, in all honesty, basically extends to the Marvel Spider-Man ones. John David Washington, I think, when he's got a bit more to chew over, he's a very engaging presence, right? Because I was a big fan of him in Black Klansman. In Tenet, I thought he may as well have been a cardboard cutout, but I think that's more to do with that film than his performance. So I think they've got a bit more. He's got a bit more to work with here, and they have an opportunity to, kind of actually try and put their stamp on it. The problem is the script, and I think what Sam Levinson wants to say with the film, it's just not. I've got to be honest, I don't think it's terribly interesting. That's really what it comes down to. It's one of these films, and maybe I've just got a low tolerance for this sort of thing. It's one of these films where the two people talk to each other in the way that, in my experience, no two real people ever talk to each other. Now, to an extent, is that what he's going for? Are they kind of like two sides of his thoughts? The sort of like the arrogant, ambitious side, and the slightly more realistic, questioning, insecure side, and reality, they reflect each other. But I mean, sure, I think there's something like that going on, but that doesn't make it any less tiresome to watch. It's very cyclical the way this goes. They are passive aggressive to one another, then they blow up at one another, then they're nice to one another, then they start becoming passive aggressive again, rinse and repeat for an hour and 40 minutes. So I think there's plenty to like about the film in terms of how it looks, and I think he does an extremely good job of mixing up the space and the way he moves the camera around the space. I think there's plenty of good stuff going on. I just think it can't really disguise what is a fundamentally pretty repetitive and uninteresting script, to be honest. Would be my view on it. Now, also, there's nuance there, and we'll maybe get into that, but overall, that's kind of like the big win and the big shortcoming of the film for me.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. I think going back to, from like Sam Levinson's career and things, I'm a big fan of him as a director, especially, his early work. I think more the way that he kind of puts his own stamp on quite well-known genres and makes them almost his own. And he is, I think, as Jim was saying, the performances really are the thing that kind of carries this film along, because I think that with everything that he does, he puts a lot, he gives his actors a lot to do. I think that's centrally when he makes a lot of productions, he puts the actors kind of in the front of the vehicle when he's making his art, and I think it pays off because he has a lot of room to nuance and write around these sometimes overplayed genres and make them transform in a way that a little bit different. He kind of, it's almost like he's not afraid to have this shared authorship with the crew and cast of his films, and I think that really shows in his style. But like Jim was saying with this one, and I have quite a lot of time for kind of repetitiveness in film if it has a purpose. The issue, I think, like Jim was saying, is in the writing itself. It's in the script. I think when you are doing something, especially that involves two characters, you need to there needs to be quite a lot of organic kind of conversation within scripts like that, because I think that if you're trying to do a wider talk about, especially in this one, about people in the art world and the filmmakers versus the critics and the everything like that, I don't think that there's anything wrong with talking about that as a subject, because I think it is something that is a good thing to bring up, especially in the way that art's kind of taken in now, especially in lockdown, the way that we kind of consume by the second. But there needs to be something more in a story between two characters than just a critique on mass culture. It doesn't hold together a script that's going to keep you really quite as focused as you would be. I think that the thing is, I think because the performances are so good, it could have easily gravitated to much more kind of colloquial, normal language between these two people that do very, very much feel alienated by each other, and it just never really grasps that in the centre of it all. So I think I'm pretty much just kind of re-saying what Jim said in his critique, but I think the main issue with it is in the language. I think if the screenplay itself was a little bit more coherent in the messages and the relationship that it wanted to build and analyse, I think that it would have actually been a much more enjoyable experience, and one that people could have connected to a lot more, especially in times of isolation. There's a lot of those sort of themes swirling around in it, even in the setting. But yeah, if you want for the aesthetic, it looks amazing. I think the whole everything that's been chosen about where it was set, how it's been filmed, has been very carefully thought out, and it has created kind of the undertones and the atmosphere that I think that it did want to achieve. So I think that it's a bit of it's one of those things where it's got the makings of everything to be really good, but there's just one screw that wasn't really, wasn't locked in tight enough to make it run as smoothly as it could.
See, I completely thought that I guess we're all saying it's not good, but I have to say I really strongly responded negatively to this film. So I don't see these positives. I do see the fact that it was shot in film, and in the sense that it's a film, and it's very it's about film and it's shot in a film. It's like, oh, great, but I go back to a lot of conversations that Jim has about films made of films, and, also pretentious filmmakers talking about it, thinking about The Souvenir as one example. And this could not be more annoying, of a bunch of filmmakers talking about films, art house films in film history, that I did know those references and whatnot, but I just found that conversation to be unrealistic and unrelatable.
Oh, completely.
As a filmmaker myself, and I didn't know enough, I guess, because I just watched it knowing nothing, and I think that was the best way. And I was like, this doesn't feel like two people actually having a normal conversation, like you're saying, but it also felt like a play that was just poorly written. And yes, the performers were very attractive and they were very good, but they weren't really committed to the actual material, because the material was unrelatable. And I know that I think we briefly mentioned that it frustrated you that film critics are getting mad about the criticism, but I wouldn't ever imagine someone to be like that, in response to in response to an evening like that. It just didn't feel like I'm the one who supported, Marriage Story, I believe. I'm not sure how many people liked Marriage Story in this, but it goes back to me saying to Netflix, I really love their documentary strands and a lot of stuff they're doing, even with television and stuff like that. But the feature films, this reminded me a lot of that Charlie Kaufman film that we had. I'm exactly the same. Yep. I'm thinking of Ending Things, where it's who in the production of films is saying, I'm going to give really famous directors the opportunity to just make whatever they want, and we're not going to look back at this and say this needs to be edited, this needs to be thought over a bit. And it's just it's frustrating me now, because this is maybe the fourth Netflix film that I'm good famous director, terrible film.
Something that's interesting on that note, were you saying you're frustrated about it? I was looking at the some information about the production, and it didn't start as a Netflix thing. I think Sam Levinson, they just made it, and then Netflix bought it after. They outbid quite a lot of other studios. They paid quite a lot of money for this. It was $30 million or something like that.
I mean, and I don't know if it comes down to, again, I've never seen Sam Levinson's other work, so I have no way to relate to that. I just, from that first experience, I found I wouldn't want to see any of his other work. It really did annoy me. And as you said, it was boring. And I have a lot of attention and time for films that I would even watch The Breakup again, So I don't mind people breaking up on camera, but not with like just diatribes. It's like a tweet rant, like, or something to me. So it felt like what people were doing on Twitter during lockdown, you know? Like, I don't know.
I'm glad you mentioned I'm thinking of ending things, right? Because now, as you know from when we did the review show, that I didn't like that at all. A lot of people did, right? But what I will say is there was at least some attempt to abstract that away from Charlie Kaufman's head, right? That's what I will say. This is basically just... It feels a little bit like Sam Levinson just speaking through the characters, and it's films like that where I have a limited amount of interest in it. What I will say is, like, I think there are some ideas kicking around in these diatribes that I think are worth discussing or are worth trying to address in the form of a film of some sort, right? The idea of the interpretation of art versus what the maker's intention was, right? Because something that's notable about that, and as I say, I think there's a lot of film critics who've got a little bit too sensitive about the anti-critic rants in here, but one thing that is interesting about them is the fact that the Malcolm character, he has a go at some critics who disliked his, I think his last fictional film, I can't remember, but he also has a go at critics who are actually praising the current one, but they're doing it in a way that he thinks is stupid because they don't know how to talk about a film by a black filmmaker. Now, without getting into the weirdness of this being expressed through a character written by Sam Levinson, who is a white director, I'm going to put that to one side for a minute. But that idea about who gets to interpret art and how could actually be an interesting thing to look at, and it could be an interesting thing to look at in, like, one of these films about films, right? I just don't think this is that film. It's not done... Like, you can't just state a few sentences about it and then pretend that you're getting into the weeds of it, like, you're actually looking at it. You're just stating the problem, and that's a problem which I think anybody who would engage with that in the script is already aware of that problem, right? So you don't gain any insight, you don't say anything by just restating the problem, right? Because if somebody isn't aware of it, you're just saying it exists. Big whoop. If somebody does know it exists, you're not saying anything about it. Again, big whoop. So it just feels like a bunch of things that, and actually, Amanda, your Twitter analogy actually isn't too bad. It feels like the sort of thing that a director would post as like a thread on Twitter in a slight annoyance or something. It's not a script.
It's honestly something I probably read in a review once I finally watched it, and then saw like what the heck am I watching, and why am I disliking it so much? Because it's pretty, and the set design it's all my kinds of type, and I love a chat about film criticism, and I think maybe it's just as I'm watching more films, these conversation films about like highbrow, like nonfiction comes to mind, that French film about like the loss of literary, like the book industry or something. It's just, if it doesn't work, and it doesn't, I mean, I hate that word, just authentic. Oh, it's not authentic, but it really just felt like I was watching these people, that they were reading something that wasn't them. That's how it felt to me. So it just wasn't enjoyable to me.
To go back to, I think, like the problem of authenticity and what Jim was saying about, the whole kind of Malcolm's character being quite angry at reviews that are misinterpreting his work and saying that it's political due to the fact that he's a black man, and the problem with Sam Levinson being a white man that's writing the script. And I think that it's so weird that this film's kind of came just now, because we have this whole discourse going on just now, especially about if you're writing about people of color or you're writing about LGBTQ characters, you can't really have a very fixed authorship. You have to have people, if you are outside of those kind of communities, you have to have people within them to kind of guide your writing. And I think it's that thing kind of it's funny because the film itself it talks a lot about authorship and, you know, who made the biggest, like, who has led this train of thought in someone's head that's made it art, and what does that mean? Do you completely own it? Is it really your credit? And it's one of those things where I think that perhaps if Sam Levinson had a few more people involved in the writing of script, that because it almost feels like he's digested things that are happening in our political climate, but he's taken fragments of all of it and kind of just throwing lots of jargon into a void and hoping that something sticks in the centre. There's no real linear argument to anything. It's just we'll take bits and pieces of the discourse that everyone else has been talking about just now within the art world, and that will make a concrete point, and well, it doesn't really at all.
I 100% agree with you on that, because I think that the authorship issue does matter, and it doesn't, but it also is, if it was even well done and or, you know, like it was a continued within the, and it was interesting, I would even, you know, like, you know, make more liberties for it. But I just didn't, you know, like I said, the only idea I can say is a Twitter is disorganized, and like nobody edited it. And, you know, that's kind of Netflix's like fault there. Like nobody at the top of, like, where I'm starting to think of streaming, you know, a streaming company shouldn't be like a film production company if they're not going to put executives in there to say, you know what, we might need to tweak this a bit. We know you're a famous person, but it might not resonate.
Yeah. Because don't get me wrong, there are in that script, right? Despite the right old kicking I've given it during this discussion, right? There are fragments of interesting ideas in there, right? And the one which it picks up and then it drops, like almost, it brings it up late and then drops it almost as quickly, is you become aware of the fact that maybe part of the reason that Marie is so annoyed that she's not been thanked as the inciting incident is because basically Malcolm seems to have mined her experiences in order to create the narrative of this fictional film, which of course we never see, right? But there's the feeling that her experiences have been exploited, and, you know, there's actually, again, there's an interesting idea there, like, you know, whose experiences can you adapt to create art? Can they be your own? Can you do other people? There's an interesting idea there, in particular in the dynamic of this relationship between two people. But again, it skims the surface of it. It doesn't go anywhere with it. It's used as a vehicle for her to get annoyed after being passive-aggressive for a bit, then they shout at each other, and then they, you know, and again, it basically becomes the reset button for this cycle in the film. It has no interest in going any deeper. So between that and interpretation, again, there are interesting ideas kicking around. It's just it doesn't do anything interesting with them, and that's exactly the same problem I think that the Charlie Kaufman film had, also a Netflix one, as you've pointed out. So it's more a case of it just leaves you feeling very unfulfilled. Like it's very intellectually malnourished. Really, it's maybe the way I'd put it. It doesn't really go particularly deep in a satisfying way on any of these ideas, and ultimately, therefore, why should you care about it?
Sam Levinson's first film kind of explores, I think this is one of the things that he's quite drawn to in the stories that he tells, is he likes to explore the kind of the dark roots of very close relationships. And his first film, Another Happy Day, it had mixed reviews. I personally really liked it. I think the reason that one perhaps worked for me when this one didn't was because I think when you're exploring these really in-depth psychological boundaries between characters, I think that the way to avoid too much criticism in what you're saying is not to try and draw such fixed conclusions about what you're doing, or I mean, and I think that in Malcolm and Marie he was kind of trying to do that, but from throwing a bunch of ideas into kind of like a whirlpool and seeing what kind of draws focus. But I think that if you're going to do that, you kind of have to have a very established set of things that you feel very comfortable speaking about, and something that's very universal that you can relate to a lot of people that are going to be watching this film. Because if you're going to do a film about kind of arts versus commercialism, arts and the art through exploitation, and the filmmaker versus the critic, you need to find a lot more human terrain to talk about these issues than just ones that are going to appeal to the art world that are going to be looking at it. Especially if you're doing a film with two characters that need to guide this all the way through. I think that the actual emotions and the actual dynamics in the relationship outside of Malcolm's career and Zendaya's inspiration for his film, a lot of it isn't just, it's not as explored as any of that, and that arguably would be the most interesting part.
I agree, but you know, I think now it will make me go back and watch Euphoria and look at Sam Levinson stuff. The only thing I knew about Sam Levinson was he was the son of Barry Levinson, who's obviously a very, very famous filmmaker. Some great films coming from there, but I mean, as far as I'm concerned, this felt like a cinephile film gone wrong, and you know, after, like I said, too many nights like in lockdown, but. You know, and Jim, I'm never gonna stop loving the Oscars, but if this is nominated for an Oscar and or gets anywhere near winning, I will throw something. I will throw something, because I'll love to hate it. But anyway, on that note, it is on Netflix, and if you want to see what we're talking about, please go check it out. So the next film we're going to review is The Mauritanian, directed by Kevin Macdonald. And Jim and Steph saw this in advance of its release. So Jim, do you want to tell us a little bit about the film?
Yeah, so the film is about a man from Mauritania, no surprise there, who was held in Guantanamo. It's based on a real story, and I think in the real case he was held for 14 years without charge, as seemed to typically happen with Guantanamo Bay. And the film is based upon a memoir of his from 2015, and Guantanamo Diary, and the author and the subject of this film is Mohamedou Ould Salahi. And basically what it does is it follows his initial arrest, capture by the US authorities, transport to Guantanamo, and the process of the legal battle for getting him out, and his then subsequent trial when it eventually comes about. And the main players in this are Taha Rahim, who plays Salahi, Jodie Foster plays his lawyer Nancy Hollander, and then on the prosecution side of things, working for the US military, looking to imprison Salahi fully and, you know, convict him of the crimes he is accused of, which is essentially recruiting the terrorists who carried out 9/11. We've got Benedict Cumberbatch as Lieutenant Couch, I think it is, who is a member of the military, but he has law qualifications and thus is basically an army lawyer. So it basically follows the development of the case, the evidence or indeed lack thereof, against Salahi, his experience in detention, and the legal battle going in parallel to either convict or free him. So I've seen this along with Steph. Steph, what did you make of the film?
I really like the film as much as you can like a film about these issues and this story. It's one of those films that makes you go down a certain rabbit hole with these political topics, because, you know, as soon as after I'd seen it, the one thing that really kind of stuck in my mind is there's not really been a lot of films about Guantanamo Bay. You know, not a lot of ones in the last few years. The most famous one, I think, still to this day, would be A Few Good Men, but that was, you know, it was pre 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have in the 2010s you have Camp. One of the ones that come to mind is Camp X-Ray with Kristen Stewart, about 6-7 years ago, and then you have most recently, in snippet form, you have being talked about a little bit in Vice. And I think this is actually the first film that I've seen that actually has the nerve to finally kind of condemn what had been happening in America and what is still happening with Guantanamo Bay. I think it was argued, I've seen a few reviews after Vice's release, that this is, done a similar thing. I would greatly disagree with that. I don't think that did anything near to what this film has done. I think because it is based on Mohamedou Ousalahi's experiences through his book, through his autobiography, I think that you learn so much that you wish that you really didn't know. But I think that it's a reminder of all the sort of omission that exists with talking about these things in cinema. You have, I remember kind of when I was falling down this rabbit hole of the Guantanamo Bay's representation in cinema, after seeing this, in every other form that it's been shown, there's a way to sort of humanise the idea of the military's conduct and the way to kind of explain why this was happening and make it seem almost that the American military in Cuba were the victims of this ordeal, which is it's quite laughable, really, in a way, when you look into especially when you see films like this and you see kind of behind the shutters of what's been going on. But I think that the performances in this film are unbelievable, especially Mohamedou. I think that he does so well and I haven't, to be honest, I haven't read his autobiography, but it compelled me to order it as soon as possible to kind of see where this is going, see what the film is kind of carried on and emphasised from this story. So I think if anything, it's definitely a political part of cinema that you shouldn't miss. It's something that that goes in and out in different depths and it's never been explored before, and it's something that definitely stays with you. So I think in a sense with political films, for me the main thing that it wants you to do is it wants you to engage and with these things, and I think you can't even really call it recent history when it's something that is still very much in existence today. So I think that and the timing of the film as well is very interesting, because we have new presidency. We have Joe Biden as the new American president, and I think the film's just a constant reminder of the fact that there was campaigns for its closure during the Obama administration, which never came to never. I don't even know how many people until they see this film would be aware, because I don't think that was heavily really in the news. I don't remember much about that. So it's all almost like this: we're being forced to bury something that's very much still alive today, and it's something that I think that it's been written in this time to sort of finally kind of. There's a lot of activism, I would say, in this film. There's a lot of truth that it wants to explore, and I just think that the way it's done, it doesn't let you kind of hide behind things anymore. I think especially because it's it's the first film to talk about it that's had a mixed range of like directors and writers, and Kevin Macdonald is a Scottish director, so I think the fact that it's got this kind of mixed board of people exploring this issue and it's not centred through American filmmakers makes it very much more on the path to condemn the actions of America, which I think that it needed to do.
It's interesting. There's a few things this film does which I'm quite impressed by. I think what's quite interesting about it is it's one of the only things I can think of that I've watched. Now, and I've not watched everything, so I'm sure somebody would probably comment with, like, what the hell are you talking about, Jim? This film did it like last week or something. But it's one of the only films I can remember recently which has depicted torture in quite the way that it does, and it does it in a way which I think gets across quite how debilitating and horrific it is without being graphic. Now that's not to say there aren't graphic elements to it, but some of that frankly comes from the filmmaking, right, and the way that some of this is depicted, and then the lens choices between when the Mohamedou character is being tortured and then when it, mercifully at some point ceases for a bit. The filmmaking choices, I think, communicate quite well how disorienting that is and why it is pursued, and how inhumane it actually is. So I think that's quite interesting in terms of how it presents perspectives. I think the way it deals with Mohamedou's character is also interesting. He's shown to be, I think, an unreliable narrator, but not in the kind of like typical deceptive sense that you usually have that done in cinema. It's more just, stuff happened a long time ago. You can't remember it very well. Like, that's really all, So I think that the way it does all that is quite interesting. I think politically it's actually quite an interesting film as well. In particular, what I'm thinking of is the way it contrasts how little arguably changes across different administrations of the US. It very pointedly lingers on a portrait of George W. Bush and Dick Cheney at one point. Later on, those portraits are replaced, but much the same stuff is going on, and the film kind of goes out of its way to actually show that happening. I think the performances in the film are really good. I think Tahar Rahim, as with so much stuff he is in, and I think my first knowledge of him was Jacques Audiard's A Prophet, and I think he's excellent in this film. Everybody around him, I think they do a good job. I think it's reasonably by the numbers, if I'm being honest. But I think the topic you're dealing with, this unlawful detention of people at Guantanamo, is where the film gets its punch from. And I think, fortunately, his performance, solidifies that. I think the rest of them are good performances. We've got good, experienced actors here, particularly in Jodie Foster and Benedict Cumberbatch, right? So you would expect to get a good performance out of them. Now, having dealt with the serious stuff, I am going to go a lot more flippant for a short period. Can we please have people stop having Benedict Cumberbatch try to do an American accent? I beg of every filmmaker on the face of the planet, please. And I just about, in the midst of this really serious film, I just about did a spit take and laughed when at one point, right? So I've got this written down here. At one point, they describe Mohamedou, who is associated with Ted, and you can read his book to figure out, to see the full extent of it, but he's been in touch at various points with people associated with terrorists, and at one point I think he's described as the Al-Qaeda Forrest Gump. He's everywhere you look. And I just about did a spit take because, quite frankly, Benedict Cumberbatch's southern accent here sounds like Forrest Gump. It's not good. I'm sorry. Stop getting this man to do American accents. It didn't do it for me. It just didn't do it for me. So it's the film is not without its small minor issues. I think it is a testament, however, to the filmmaking, and in particular that central performance of Tahar Rahim, that such small things like Benedict Cumberbatch's terrible southern accent didn't particularly bother me. I think it's a very, I know it's people say this about films all the time. It's a powerful film, but I think it is, and I think it gets across quite how bad this situation is, and quite how ignored it is as well. And I think that's also highlighted in the filmmaking, right? Because the contrast between the way that the law officers are presented in America, and I think it's somewhere in New Mexico, I think, where Nancy Hollander works, and then these kind of very brightly lit, saturated colours of the coast of Cuba in the case of Guantanamo Bay. It's even highlighting that contrast. It's a completely different world. People don't pay attention to it. It's in the middle of nowhere to the average American, and I think it gets that all across quite well and in quite subtle ways. But yeah, just don't have Benedict Cumberbatch doing an American accent.
Well, I think you make a good point there, Jim, and we can all agree, Benedict, keep with your native accent. So, but do watch The Mauritanian. It is on Glasgow Film Festival, and then after that, it'll be I think at Glasgow at Home, Glasgow Film at Home, other various sources. You can check it out in the UK and in the US. So the next film we're going to review is also going to be the Glasgow Film Festival. And to note, we are doing a Glasgow Film Festival special as well coming up. So there will be more that we'll be doing, but lots of great stuff on offer. But is The Dissident. So it's Bryan Fogel's next documentary. And Jim, tell us a little bit about that film.
Yeah, so the dissident in question is Jamal Khashoggi, who is the Saudi Arabian journalist who was murdered at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul at the end of 2018, I think it was. And basically, Bryan Fogel, who made Icarus, which I think did it win the documentary Oscar?
I think
it did win the Oscar.
It did win the Oscar, yeah.
Yeah, so it's him making this. And obviously, he'd won that for the documentary about the Russian state-sponsored doping program for the Olympics. So it takes a fairly similar approach here in terms of presentation. It's very kind of intense, musically driven. It kind of goes for almost a sort of like thriller like tone. But it's actually dealing with a few strands, right? The first and most obvious one is the chronology of what happened to Jamal Khashoggi at the consulate in terms of like what led him to go there, the discovery of tapes of it, the timeline, and the fallout from it. The other strands it's also dealing with are Mohammed bin Salman, so the Crown Prince, the son of King Salman in Saudi Arabia, his attempts to modernise the country and the methods that he is following to try and do that, and in particular, the way that they are dealing with outspoken critics of the regime at home and abroad. And part of that is they follow an associate of Jamal Khashoggi's, Omar Abdulaziz, who's in Montreal in Canada, and basically also follows his journey from basically a very small voice on Twitter criticising the regime up to now presenting, I think it's a YouTube show where basically he criticises the Saudi regime on a very regular basis. So it's dealing with these various kind of different strands and kind of the cyber war, cyber terrorism capabilities that Saudi Arabia has as well. So it's juggling a lot of things, but it tries to weave them all together. I, for one, found it pretty effective and engaging. I do have some issues with it, but as somebody who I followed the Jamal Khashoggi story as it happened. I remember his disappearance and it then coming out that he had died. I remember the former president's pronouncements or lack of them on the matter and all the rest of it. So I was following it pretty closely when it happened. There is something that is particularly galling about seeing it all laid out at once, though. And that chronology and basically trying to capture the apprehension and confusion around what had happened and kind of like then kind of grappling with what the full horror of what actually went down, chopping the man's body up. I mean, there is something about laying it all out in front of you in the form of this documentary which makes it particularly galling and particularly striking. And I think we'll get into a bit about how Bryan Fogel goes about doing that, but I do think it's done pretty effectively.
I saw Icarus, and I think it was because one of actually a former colleague on this, Annie, had been telling me about it, and it wasn't something that maybe I had wanted to see, but then I heard it was so good, I did, because the premise of Icarus when it begins, and I know we're not talking about that film, but is bothered me that it felt like another Morgan Spurlock Super Size Me kind of director trying to prove something, and then what he uncovered was shocking. And like the character was incredibly interesting. So I didn't have that many expectations about this next film. Like he's going to find another story he kind of fell upon that story and is uncovered in the documentary. And hence, it wins an Oscar. It was really well done. It was on Netflix. It was a big thing, again, talking about Netflix in the primary force of documentary films. But this film was also, like, incredibly captivating. As you mentioned, I mean, I think it was just such a huge thing in the press and the news when the time it came. It happened to come out probably when I was writing my master's, so I was less focused on the news as much. But laying it all out in a film like this really pinpoints, how horrible the situation was, and it was an incredible story about what happened. Do I think it's as good and interesting as like Icarus was? Like, in terms of a film, it's a film with a lot of, pretty well expensive, like, shots, like interview shots. It's but it kept me, like, we'll be talking about another film that's quite beautiful as well, I think, later, but it kept me riveted through the whole thing, even though I did know enough about the story from the news. So in that case, you can't not give it credit if your attention is there, and what you learn and uncover from it, looking back at it. So, I would say it's well worth watching, and it's well worth watching for the importance of seeing, the importance of this story and what happened and what's continuing to happen.
Yeah, I was very excited to see Dissident. I was a big fan of Icarus. His documentary that I think is still available on Netflix just now. And I think that Bryan Fogel is going to be quite synonymous with more and more with the whistleblower director. He goes into these crevices to explore these, like, facets of corruption that are quite. There's quite a lot of there's quite a lot available, and there's quite a lot that's just not. And I think that the one criticism that this film might face is that, you're relaying something that was on the news, not that long ago, it was a few years ago now, I think, but it's modern media that's been, so it's just a new way to kind of consume and digest the story. But I think that the more that you go through this documentary, the more that you realise that it's saying a lot more than just what was on the surface news and what was available on the web. I think that it goes further than just like it starts off with the timeline of Jamal Khashoggi's disappearance to his murder, to the aftermath, into a great detail that I think that it's been. I'm not going to say that wasn't necessarily accessible, but one that has not been very much as advertised. I think that it's one of those things, the same thing that he did in Icarus. It tests the boundaries of what is, or more like who is above the law. And I think especially in this day and age, with the more that we have kind of seen this tampering with information, especially on the web, it becomes a lot more clear that there are certain sectors of in government and parliament and monarchy that do kind of hit that tail so we. It's something that I think when you go deeper into it, because I think with them a lot of films that talk about a lot of documentaries that talk about sort of oppression of the people in governments where it's quite tight-lipped, and that you do have you are censored in what you are able to say about your government, and you are censored about what you are able to make criticism of. So and when you go deeper into it, you can see kind of this kind of mirror between what's been happening very recently in the world and what was only happening a couple of years ago, and there's not really been a lot of change at all. I think especially when it plunges deep into the social media aspects of people being able to distort the narrative and the things that you're saying, that there's actually a lot of that is already pre-programmed, a lot of that's already predestined to stop these conversations taking place. So I think that if you're going into watching it thinking, oh, it's going to be just what was keeping up with the news about Jamal Khashoggi, it's going to be about things I already know. I wouldn't say it is. I would say that it goes much, much deeper into the problems with accessibility, the problems of censorship, and the legal problems within governments. And I think that it's something that's we did need a documentary on. I think it's a case that it brings up at the end, that they didn't want this case to die with the news story. They wanted to keep bringing it. And I think that while it was quite heavily mediaized at the time, it's been something that's also almost been pushed to the side as quickly as it was kind of a light. So we have this problem where now it's brought the fire back to these issues. So I would say that it is quite a revealing political documentary, and it says a lot more than I think that you would think it does.
So to add a little bit more praise to it before I maybe I'm just slightly critical of aspects of it, I think what it does extremely effectively, and I think this is the so yes, this was a big news story, and as we said, to varying degrees, we were all aware of it at the time, and an easy criticism would be, well, this was covered in the news. It's not adding new information, but that's the thing, it is, and I think that's part of what is good about it, and what I think any documentary that was covering this sort of topic would have to do, and that's add context to the situation, and I think it does that really pretty effectively. And the two that effectively come to mind to me are, one, the use of social media, in particular its relation to the Arab Spring, right? Because I think it's very easy to get caught up in the horror of what happened to Jamal Khashoggi. I mean, understandably, because it is horrific, right? But I think something that adds understanding and a certain more long-lasting horror to it are the motivations for it. And I think what this film does very effectively is it lays out what the motivations were of the Saudi state to remove Jamal Khashoggi. And it does that in two ways. The first is the use of social media, and in particular how that has transformed the landscape of how things are spoken about in politics, in particular countries that do not have the luxury of a free press. That's the first part of it, and you come to understand the impact that had on Jamal Khashoggi and his understanding. It talks about the uprising in Egypt and the overthrow of Mubarak and kind of how he was inspired by that. That's one part of it. The other part of it is the reforms of Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi, and the way that he's kind of, in some ways liberalising the country, in the sense that, there are further rights for women from the extremely low bar they were starting with, etc. But there is this attempt to modernise the country, and I think what it's getting across is, and I think it says explicitly in one of the intertitles, how modernisation doesn't always equate to progress, right? And this is a key example of why. And I think what it does very well is it weaves all these strands together to not only get across what happened, which is horrible, but why it happened, which is abhorrent. And I think that's an important context to add to the situation. I think that's what makes the documentary so effective. My criticism of it is I think it dilutes some of its points by lingering on some of these things a little bit too long. In particular, there's quite a lot of animations around. So one of the key things is this troll farm that has effectively been set up in Saudi Arabia to swarm critics of the regime on social media with negative feedback and negative interaction engagement, so that they are silenced and pushed to the bottom. And then the attempts of other people, in particular in the film, Omar and Abdulaziz, to counter that with their own makeshift way of pushing them back to the top. And there's a lot of very overblown animations around that, and the hacking of it. I think we're living in an age now where I don't think you need these weird CGI intertitles that are, they look like something from a 90s music show or something. You don't need that to get across the idea of a phone being hacked, right? I think we're living in an age where you can understand the role of social media, and some of them are fine, like in terms of kind of like tweets flying out of the screen or something. I think it gets across the volume and the nature of what was going on quite effectively. But when you start getting into kind of like, metaphorical animations around bees and flies and stuff, it doesn't need any of this. And I think it maybe lingers in some of that a little bit too long and stretches it out and dilutes it a little bit. It's a minor criticism ultimately, because I think it still achieves what it wants to extremely effectively, but there are these little embellishments which I remember from Icarus as well, but in Icarus they were actually used to illustrate things. They were to do with kind of like the transport of how they got the drugs around it, and I remember
it was like the map of how it happened, or how like there was a hole in the wall or something like that. Yeah,
but the thing is that actually helped to illustrate what was going on. I don't think here it does. I think it's unnecessary embellishment, and if anything, just makes it look a bit silly, to be honest. But as I say, the film still achieves what it wants to, so I don't think it's a big criticism. But I do think it's something which is transferred over from Icarus, which I don't think is deployed even nearly as effectively here.
It's weird that you say that. Bring up the tacky kind of CGI illustrations, because it reminded me a lot when I was watching it. I don't know if anyone seen that the Social Experiment, the documentary on Netflix, talking about how you're being controlled and monitored through your search history, and things are programmed to take you down these passages within the web and things like that. But I don't know where this trend sort of started with, that we have these CGIs talking about the digital world and the real world as such. I don't think anyone's in any way confusing those two worlds. I don't think anyone believes, like, the more and more that we're learning about a technology and through all these shows, Black Mirror-esque kind of avenues, I don't think anyone's questioning that anymore. I don't think there needs to be this separation between them both. I think that everyone's very aware that the internet is grossly, misinformation and it's things like that. So I think it possibly was trying to copy, like, kind of that, this fake reality sense of it. But I don't think that it didn't really seem to kind of gel, and it didn't really seem to kind of gel with the format of the documentary. It didn't really, like, I wasn't expecting there to be any kind of animations like that. It sort of just came out of nowhere, and it was a little bit overused.
If you were to describe the notion of this documentary, I think if you then said there was an animation of a bee stabbing a fly through the hedge, you'd go like, "What the hell was going on here?"
Okay, the bee stuff was a little mad, yes, and I totally, as a metaphor, exactly. I think it's just, I mean, I don't know how many this is just a standard, as someone who worked in corporate video for 10 years, it's a standard way of how you handle things that you don't know how to handle because you don't have the footage to do so. So it really is outdated, and maybe it's not as outdated in high-end. He was making a high-end documentary, and he's coming from obviously like an amateur, a sportsman who wants to make a documentary, who found a great story, who's now continuing on. That's why I keep connecting him to Morgan Spurlock, because Morgan Spurlock came out with this film that became massively popular. It's one of my least favorite films on the planet, Super Size Me. But through that, he continually made films, and they got worse and worse and worse. And we just realized, well, he just had a good, he had this one hit. And I think that this is showing that Bryan Fogel is actually doing something different, and he's trying, or as you call him, like a whistleblower filmmaker. He's exploring things. When he went to make one film, he made another, but that turned him into this kind of work. And so watching him make a fairly astute film, those things that we're talking about are aesthetics. And I kind of remember even like in the Almodovar film we last saw, like there was an animation part that like annoyed me. So it's animations mixed in with documentary is just super 2005. And maybe very like, I don't know, Mission Impossible, or I'm messing it up, but like some sort of kind of like way that films were made about 10 years ago.
As hackers.
Yes.
This film gets a kick in for this
but
sort of shit.
It's not as bad, and I was gonna bring up The Social Dilemma. I think that's what it's called, because I watched like half of it over Christmas break, because everyone's like, oh, I'm turning my Facebook off, I'm turning this off because I saw this film, it's like revolutionary. And I'm like, what is this film? Like, why it's so revolutionary? What is it telling us? and it really is annoying. Like all those animations, and there's the guy from Mad Men is in there, and he's like acting as the social media algorithm. I mean, it's not that it's not news we don't know, but I think this film actually does critically show like the issue of social media and its role within society in a better way than that Netflix Social Dilemma film did. Not that I don't disagree, like it taught me a lot, but this kind of like trying to explore this, what's going on in the social social media and how do we visually show it, doesn't need to be done in animations, but it's a simple, quick, like kind of cop out, kind of the same way that like historical reenactments were done in regular in films for years and years and years. The only other thing I would say is that it's similar to I don't think this film is as good as something like Citizen 4, that Edward Snowden film, but then in the same way Icarus and Snowden have that kind of like luxury of being the documentary, being the story, being part of the actual happening. And so this is looking back 2 years ago or whenever and seeing something and then putting it together. There is new information maybe that's happened since 2 years ago, and like you said, Steph, it's not something that we watched it for a few months like non-stop, and then we moved on to something else because it's been a crazy, terrible 4 years. So we forgot about it, and I think it's a really nice record of an important thing that's still going on.
I think that contextualization the film does is the important thing. Like, I mean, when all those strands are laid together like that, and then not that I want to keep coming back to Trump now that he's like mercifully no longer in the Oval Office, but not that I want to keep coming back to that, but it's like if you focus just on the murder, like literally on the act of murder of Jamal Khashoggi, it becomes very easy to do what Trump attempted to do at one point, which is like dismiss them as rogue actors or something. But when you put all these things together, it really does build up a complete picture, which if anything, as I say, puts a kind of a far more insidious horror over the grisliness of the act itself. And I think, despite my issues with the animation and stuff, I think that's what this documentary does extremely well.
Yeah, I just want to be clear and say that, even though the animation won't regret, I'm not going to compare it as to the abhorrent amounts of the social dilemma, and like Jim said, the actual contextualization of the documentary as a whole, and the way that it kind of brings all these things to the forefront and shows you much more in depth into the political world in which this was allowed to happen. I think that it's definitely one that needs to be watched, especially if you're not familiar with the case, or even if it's even if you haven't re-explored it since it broke out, because I think that a lot of people have lost touch with a lot of news stories, like you were saying, Amanda, with all the massive horrible news that's been coming for the last few years. It's easy to lose touch with things that have happened even not that long ago, so it's always good to refresh in these kind of documentaries.
Yeah, and The Dissident will be out at Glasgow Film Festival, and then shortly thereafter, hopefully online, I believe. Jim, did you say it was March 5th?
It was scheduled for March 5th. Whether it's still going to be scheduled for March 5th in the near future, we'll see. But it's definitely going to be. Yeah, it's definitely going to be on Glasgow Film Festival and Glasgow Film at Home from the 6th to the 9th.
Okay, so the final film we're going to review this month is the new documentary by Gianfranco Rosi, Notturno. It premiered originally at the Venice Film Festival. It was also on the London Film Festival, but it is out streaming March 5th. So, Steph, tell us a little bit about this film.
It's basically a documentary that's exploring the aftermath of the war in the Middle East and people and how people are surviving through that. It goes through lots of different stories, from people struggling with poverty to people being very much still in very active war, actively violent places within there. You have people, chatting to gunfire in the background, and it goes into talking about people's experiences with ISIS and the kind of the trauma that's left with them. And it's very much a very harrowing documentary of people that are mourning the loss of parts of their country and their loved ones, and how they're having to rebuild their lives and homes and the place that's sort of long since changed from years ago. So I won't give too much more. I think the film itself is very much one that is quite organic and it flows through the characters' lives and stuff, so it's very difficult to summarise plot-wise, but it's very much guided through these people who still survive there to this day.
I like this a lot. It's quite interesting we're talking about it in this particular episode of the show, actually, because I mean it's a very, very different documentary to something like The Dissident, and obviously it's dealing with the same region. I mean, I don't think we deal with Saudi at any point here for obvious reasons, because it's mainly areas that were affected by ISIS, right? So you're Iraq, Kurdistan, Syria, Lebanon, these places. I like this a lot. I think it's I don't want to say aggressively, but it's aggressively observational in the sense that it's very much, the camera is stuck down somewhere, and then basically Rosie just lets the scene, whatever that may be, play out in front of him. And I think it grabbed me from the very opening, and I think it shows quite a lot of craft, even just in how he's captured that opening scene. The opening scene is basically soldiers doing drills, right? They're basically running around, and they're doing a wee chant or something every so often, as they go around and get their knees up and all the rest of it. But the way it's captured is basically like one kind of like just kind of gets out of earshot and fades away before like bang, another one comes in, and that kind of care around how to capture the scene, I think, plays into all the other ones that then subsequently go on. Whether it's you have children recounting kind of some of the horrors that ISIS perpetrated. You've got female fighters. You've got just a couple on a rooftop at one point. Just taking the evening in. And I think what I quite liked about it is it would be very easy, I think, to characterize this as, particularly because Rosie is Italian, right, and he's not from the region, he's an outside observer. It would be very easy to characterize this as, the aestheticization of the trauma of the people in these regions. I don't think that's what he's doing here. I firmly believe that, because I think it's very much an attempt to show that despite the trauma these regions have suffered, people's lives go on, and some of them are deeply, deeply affected by it, and everybody is affected by it, but there are also people who are getting on with their lives amidst this, and I think it captures all of that really pretty well. I like the fact that it doesn't expressly say where any of its vignettes are, or at least if it does, I can't really remember any of them, despite the fact that in terms of our understanding of the national borders here, it must go all around the place. And really, it looks incredible. I mean, I don't really understand even how some of these images are captured, to be honest. So I think this has got a lot going for it, and I think that I try to avoid consuming too much in terms of other reviews before I write or talk about a film. I have seen a few criticisms of this film that say it's effectively trauma porn. I disagree with that quite strongly, to be honest. And I think it's very affecting. I think it looks incredible as well, and I think the fact that it captures that within the context it does adds to what he's trying to achieve with the film. And I was a big fan of it. I think it was extremely effective.
See, I was really excited to see this because of his previous film, Fire at Sea, and not necessarily, I don't know if you've both seen that film. I have some strong love-hate issues with that. Like, I really, it really did it was stunning. And I think go back to this idea that we're showing two films of two filmmakers who've done really quite well with their previous film, and they're coming into this next film. And this film in particular that we're talking about right now, it makes me happy that we're, that I'm making documentaries during this era, because the fact that you can create shots like he has for this film with the technology that's out there. I mean, it's just incredible. The film is beautiful. I don't think there's a film we've seen in the last year that I've seen shots that I think are as beautiful as in Notturno. When the prisoners are coming out in the red, and just the way that he frames everything, and the wide shot of the people in this the psychiatric hospital that are performing the play. It's gorgeous. It's a gorgeous film. But with Fire at Sea, I felt so far I felt like there was these harrowing stories of people coming into Lampedusa, and then the half of the film is about a little boy like throwing rocks around, and I just it felt dismembered, and it felt like two films, and it didn't feel like it ever kind of came together. And like I think what you mentioned about this idea, Jim, about hyper observational, I'm torn, and I think maybe I need to come back to this a couple months later and think about it, because I just saw it a couple days ago. But I love a Frederick Weissman film, and where's Mark when you need him? Where you're sitting there for hours just watching things unfurl in institutions and organizations and stuff. But when it's so powerful, it's not only so beautiful, but also the stories are so incredibly harrowing, as you say, Steph. It's hard. It's hard to think about the fact that this is made in a very art house kind of festival circuit for the possibility of winning an Oscar. Those things still I don't know. It's just, it kind of hits me a little bit. And I felt that a little bit with the story in Lampedusa with Fire at Sea, where then the next year there was a short film that was also nominated for an Oscar that was around Lesbos, and kind of a similar story. And while it was not as artfully done, it was, it had more emotion, or it had more character. It had a different kind of perspective to it. So I don't know. I mean, I'm torn, because there's aspects of this I absolutely love, and then there's other aspects of it that aren't as obviously. It's it's a bunch of vignettes together. It's a little bit not you don't know where they are, who you're talking. It's just observational, but it doesn't kind of ever kind of explain any of that stuff. So it's very far back. I'm mixed about it, to be honest.
Yeah, I can understand why. To me, though, whenever we try and capture something like this on film, there is a certain, particularly when it's done in a certain way, that there is a certain amount of squeamishness about it. And to talk about something which, I'm trying to remember if we did on the show, I'm not sure, I think we did way back when. One film where it came up was Capernaum, the one about the kid, and I think, I'm forgetting where it was now, I think it was Lebanon. And that kind of that was obviously a narrative film, but it had some of the same criticisms. And I can see where they come from, but it's more, in some ways, the fact that this is set where it is, I don't really see why things can't be presented that way. I would argue that in capturing something and making it look as beautiful as it does here, it's almost as I just feel like whenever we talk about this, it's like there's this idea that when we are capturing places that have been through trauma, we cannot present them as being beautiful places. And I think the tragedy of, in particular, the likes of Syria and Lebanon is they are. I mean, these places have been scarred by these events, and I think the ability to present on film the people who have suffered the traumas of that region, but still give a hint as to why these people would want to call it home, and why they have an affinity for it, as any of us would. I actually think that does something interesting and powerful, and I think, and to me, that's where the power of this film comes from. It doesn't come purely from, oh my god, isn't this horrible what this region, these people have been through. It's also the idea that the people that are presented in the film have lives, and they've been upended by it, and this is their home. It's not just somewhere where bad news happens, right? And I think this is where I struggle with some of these criticisms, is because, you know, we need to be able to understand that people have lives that go on in these places. And I think this desire to not present that in a aesthetically pleasing way is in its own way, to me, I think that's disingenuous, because it implies that these places, they are nothing but their trauma, and I don't think they are. It's, I suppose, what I'm trying to drive at.
No, I don't disagree. I mean, I think what's most powerful to me is the quotidian of the story. Like, this is the life that goes on after war is hit, but then it's the fact that quotidian, that every day, is so dramatically different, and I think that's what comes across so beautifully and really well presented. And again, I think he is the film. I think he's the camera person. He's the sound person. I don't know how he does it. I would like to take a course with him directly. Like, you know, I mean, it's phenomenal filmmaking. I think this actually, to me, is better, and it feels more you know, earnest and and sort of empathetic than I actually felt the Fire at Sea did.
I've also seen Fire at Sea as well, and I think that in at least the last half of last year and the beginning of this year, there's been so many. I think it's been such a good run for documentaries. There's been so many interesting ones, and the way that people are approaching documentaries now are quite a lot different. You have this, I think, if you go back, you know, not even that many years ago, I think the documentaries were quite, you know, taken and explored in quite similar ways. But now we have this kind of, people want to take a more of a back seat when exploring these issues. I think that the problem is when you go into, especially regarding that Rossi's not from the Middle East, he's Italian, and I think when he's going into this film, there's quite a blurred line between showing, documenting life on camera and showing these places in the aftermath of war and during war, to show how life is progressing and how life continues to these people. And I think that there's not a long way to go from there until it can become quite exploitative and quite sensationalist about these countries and what because I think, especially in many places, we're so far removed from anything near that life that I think we're always wanting to know more about something that I think Rossi kind of acknowledges that I don't think that we could ever fundamentally really understand that way of life. I think it's something that he takes the things in these regions that are just universal to everyone. You know, you have shots of, like, beautiful shots of a couple on a roof with like a shisha pipe, and then the only difference between, you know, their life and a lot of places is that, you know, we don't have gunfire in the background. But they get on with it, as I suppose Jim was saying. With Fire at Sea as well, I do understand what Amanda means about two different stories within the one and the collision. I think that, to me, it didn't really bother me that it was shot like that, but I can see why that would become quite distancing for people when you're talking about European, like, migration into Italy and things like that. And I think that, again, it's that thing where how far can you show the lives of these struggling people without using them to your advantage to sell a story into your documentary. There was a few. I remember. I think I wrote a piece for Take One about a documentary called Peer Kids, and it was in America, and it was talking about homeless LGBTQ youth that were struggling on the outskirts, and it was one of those things where it let people tell their own stories. It wasn't guiding into this way of this narrative of America, of what it's saying about these regions. And I think that's pretty much what Rosi does here. I think that he wants to be quite an organic filmmaker, and I think that can be confusing when you see how aesthetically quite beautiful all these shots are, and how much there are kind of a lot of art house undertones to the way that he shoots these regions, and the way that he sort of lays the camera down to be quite static and explores all these really beautiful parts of the land. But I think that it's more the sense that I don't know if he particularly knows how to tell a story like that, and I don't think that he necessarily really needs to. I don't think that looking at the lives of people in those situations can really be summarised in about an hour and just over 2 hours as such. So it is one of those documentaries I think that will stay with me.
Absolutely, and Fire at Sea stayed with me, and there's not for me to say that I don't like the film. It's just that it raises questions, and I think when we did Il Mio Corpo a couple months ago, and it has that similar kind of crafted sense, although it was much more of a hybrid than this is. But there are lots of things of this that are planted in front of the shot. The shots are created. People are standing in front of this, and he's kind of directing them to a certain extent to get the right shot. So it's kind of this, I don't know if it's just Italian, but it seems to be a very similar sort of Italian tradition of how documentaries are made in this new way, in kind of a new way that's very, very different than The Dissident, which is, so American with its like animations and whatnot. So they're both different, and they're both actually like equally relevant in teaching us about the world. So I'm not completely criticizing it, though I do see where that controversy or that concern is, especially because who's watching it and what's the audience, and the audience is the Berlinale. It's this international kind of art house. That's what it's made for. And so it's just it's an interesting question that is out there now that it's been made, but there's no question that it's quite beautiful, and the people are, the stories are are harrowing and so sad. So we highly recommend that you watch the film, and so check it out when it comes out online.
So I had the opportunity to talk to Alex Camilleri, the director of Luzzu, which was one of the films I saw at the Sundance Film Festival, probably my favourite of the festival. So keep an eye out for that whenever it pops up elsewhere on the festival circuit. It was filmed in Malta, and it follows a Maltese fisherman and his attempts to kind of maintain his way of life in the face of modernisation and personal troubles and various other things. Alex himself is a Maltese American. He filmed it in Malta with non-professional actors, and I think it's an extremely good, extremely effective film. I was very pleased to get the chance to talk to him, and we'll go into the interview now. And I started off by asking him about the locations in Malta and why he chose the places he did, because it's very striking, some of the visual contrasts that he comes up with. So, first of all, thank you for the film. I really enjoyed it. It's stayed with me for quite a long time after watching it. I wanted to ask you to start off with about the location. Now, obviously, like Malta is obviously very, very close to your heart, but I was thinking on a more specific level, because one of the things that stood out to me was the way that you kind of contrast the very small scale in terms of the world, but obviously the stakes are very high. Trials that Jesmark goes through with some of the stuff around him, like contrasting Lutzu with, he's having a conversation with his wife with that kind of like the container ship looming in the background, and that sort of thing. And there were lots of little moments like that stood out to me, and a lot of it came down to the location stuff. So I was wondering how did you come up with the locations in Malta that you wanted to film at?
I love locations. It's my favorite part of the whole process. And they were so intrinsic to this project because I wasn't just writing a sort of black box drama. I always knew that just as I was articulating things very specifically through the characters, I would also be trying to do that visually through the world. That's the kind of the primary tool that we were working with. And because we were shooting on a micro budget, essentially all on location, the physical environments become all that more important. The Maltese sun in October is brilliant, and so you basically don't have to change your f-stop for about 12 hours, and that opens you up to being able to point the camera anywhere, and you just can make something really good out of it, quite readily. So I had some very specific locations in mind while writing. So that shot that you highlighted about the container ships while they're having that conversation, for instance, that was just baked into the script from the get-go. And these are just places that I know, but that are also just familiar to anyone who is accustomed to Malta, and where my perhaps job, my role comes in is to take those locations that everyone sees every day and just give them meaning, put them into a context to elicit the emotions. And that's the director's job, like a chef, combine these ingredients in the right order, in the right combination, at the right intensity, and you can elicit something that goes beyond the everyday. And these locations, as I mentioned before, they're so commonplace, and everyone knows them. And often what I find in Malta is that people look away from them. You sort of close your eyes, not literally, but you would ignore them in some sense just to get through your day. They're not the most picturesque parts of the island. And I always feel like I perhaps bring a freshness of view because I'm both an insider and an outsider to Malta, that these things haven't yet lost their impact on me as they might if I was fully
every day.
Thinking of them every day and running into them every day. And I would have to put them out of my mind, just like I do here in New York City. There's probably an amazing street that I ignore because I have to walk through it and the pavement is cracked or whatever, and I don't like it. But there can be a specific kind of beauty in it, and in the right hands, of course, that beauty can come out.
Talking about things that were baked into the script, I was wondering, how did you decide when to insert these little nods and moments to things? Because there's a discussion with the fish market boss about environmental concerns, and it's there very briefly, but it kind of informs a lot of things that happen in the interaction with that character. But things like the cost of healthcare, the precariousness of migrants, because you've got Uday on the boat and things like that. How did you decide when to put them in the script? Because they all kind of get their own moment. None of them are lost, but they are all there. There's quite a lot of ground covered, so I'm really just wondering how you decided to pace and measure that out in the script.
I knew from the beginning that there were things that I wanted to say, but all of the things that I want to say have to be sublimated to the drama. And I'm interested in the world, and I want to have my eyes open. I don't want to make a nostalgic film. This is not about some romantic idea of what the life of fishermen is like. And to get all those things in, it's tricky because you don't want to make an issue film and you don't want to feel like you're preaching, and everyone gets turned off by those things, and I certainly do. So I think that the best way to go about it is just, make sure you're telling everything through a strong perspective. And this film is focused like a laser on Jesmark. He's in every scene but one in the film. And as long as I think information is being parceled to the character in a believable way at the right time in his journey, then I think the audience accepts it. And I think you just have a little bit of patience and trust in the audience that, okay, even if you don't need to begin with a topic sentence and then underneath it give all your points. Sometimes you're just giving a little bit of a hint, and then we don't get to that stuff about climate change really until maybe 3/4 of the way through the film. And you have faith in the audience that they're smart enough that they don't need to be kind of told what are these forces that are lurking in the background and putting all these pressures on Jesmark. And if you have that faith, the audience will reward you. The conventional knowledge, of course, is that you're not smarter than the audience is smarter than you, and I find that to be true. And I'm kind of surprised about how much we get into the film. Maybe it's too much, I don't know, but yeah, I mean, we get into climate change, we get into EU regulation, we get into migration, we get into racism, we get into politics a little bit, but that's also, I think, it matches the film. That's the project of the film, and it's in a genre in a way that the audience is going to accept it if they like this kind of film, and it's part and parcel in the style. So I think we can do it.
One thing I want to ask you about, just because when I was looking up who worked on the film, it was just an interesting link to me. Now maybe it's because I'm British, but I mean, it reminded me quite strongly of Ken Loach's work. And of course, once I go digging, I see that you were working with Leo Lefebvre, who of course has worked with Loach. I was just wondering, how did that link come about? How did you end up working with him, and in particular to form the way the film looks? Because of course it informs kind of the whole tone and mood of the piece. And there's quite a lot of it, like, even though, like, as you said, that the Maltese Sun, you probably had a lot of daylight hours. There's a very varied look. So I was just wondering how you ended up working with him, and what work you did to come up with the look of the film, really.
Well, I'm as Ken Loach obsessive, and I think certainly he and of course the films with Paul Laverty are a big influence on this. I can't deny that. But I was delighted, when I met Leo. That wasn't the first thing that I knew about him, but it was an unexpected treat because he was part of the camera crew on 3 of the recent Loach films, and somehow that language spoke to me. I wasn't sure that was the exact cinematic language for this film. I was thinking about Loach a lot, kind of in the writing more so than in the directing and the mise en scène and the cinematography. But it was great to speak to Leo, just to know the ethos, for instance, on those sets. What is a day like on a Ken Loach set? I just loved hearing about that. But even, we could look at scenes specifically if we did want to reference them. And he was an amazing resource because there was, I could just ask, like, okay, what lens are they on here? And where was the camera and where was the crew tucked away? And he just had all the memories of how they actually did it. So that was awesome. But Leo had a lot else to bring to the table and had a strong documentary background too. And he had recently worked on a film in Algeria that was also a very small budget film with a lot of heart and kind of in a difficult, sort of unconventional cinema environment, right? So those combinations made him the perfect guy for the job. We developed a style, first kind of theoretically talking about things that we liked, and we loved so many of the same films beyond just the Loach films. And so it was very easy to get started. And I think we thought that we might try to shoot a bit more on the tripod, like Ken Loach does. But it's important that you have your eyes open once you get on set. And we realized the way that Jesmark moved somehow, that the tripod wasn't doing him as many favors, and that he kind of had a different energy, and we needed to go on the shoulder a little bit more. So we ended up, combining more handheld with tripod, and Leo is very adaptable, and he's a very skilled operator and can kind of do everything. So that was a wonderful moment for me, just as a first-time filmmaker, to be like, okay, it's cool to come in with plans and to be very intentional, but you got to wake up and be like, if this plan doesn't work, let's change, and let's be alive to what's being fed to us here on set.
On the technical elements, and so this is your first feature directing. You got a lot of editing experience. Do you feel like that changed the way you shot things, or were there specific things that maybe your editing experience informed what you were doing on set, or even during the writing process potentially?
I hope so. I mean, to speak about set first, yeah, I mean, I think the conventional kind of wisdom about sort of shooting for the edit is valuable. In some ways, at times you do have to let off, you have to kind of let the slack out a little bit. You don't want to shoot too tightly. You want to, well, I guess it goes both ways if you're talking about the edit. In one sense, people might say shoot for the edit, meaning just get the coverage that you need. And in that way, I think I had a strong sensibility of like, what are the shots that we need to cover? Like, I think I used like every setup we ever shot in this film. Like there were no extraneous setups. Like that didn't really ever happen. But, I also had a background in documentary, and that informed a different sense of shooting for the edit, which is sometimes you just got to shoot stuff out, and what you're trying to do is you need to get a lot of lumber, and you're going to go home and you're going to build a little house for yourself. But, if you don't get that lumber, you can't build the house. And, sometimes you just needed to let it roll. I'm thinking about, for instance, a scene where there's a group of old fishermen and they're all chewing the fat, talking about stories and griping. And I mean, it was really just like a documentary shoot. And, we just did various passes and put the camera in different places. So I guess that is similarly informed by editing and knowing when to switch the gear about this is the type of material we need here. And then in this other place, okay, we don't need to do that, but let's be smart about what the coverage is. I'm really grateful to the background in editing. I think it's tremendous training for filmmakers, and it's a bit surprising, and people have picked up on it, to be honest, that I did make a transition from editing to directing. I think because it's unusual, and I'm not sure why it's so unusual, because editors are really, tremendous storytellers. They just get to the heart of like, what are the shots you need to tell the story, and that is valuable in directing.
One thing I want to ask you about, and I've been asking a lot of filmmakers this, who I've been interviewing in the past, year now, basically. What are your hopes for the film during this period? Because you've in particular premiered at Sundance during this particularly strange period when it's basically all happening remotely. We're talking about a film that screened at a Utah Film Festival, and I'm sitting in the UK and you're sitting in New York, and we're from, to a certain extent, we're pretending that this is all normal. But I'm used to seeing things at a film festival where often the filmmaker will be standing at the back of the room, kind of like keenly studying everybody's reactions, because it's the first kind of like big audience that has seen the film, and obviously you haven't really had a chance to do that. Are you hoping to try and get that at some point, or and what are your hopes for the film off the back of that, in terms of like is it playing at more festivals? Is it going to, do you just want people to see it any way that's possible, or a little of all of the above?
Yeah. Well, by this point in the pandemic, I have a certain humility about these things that we can't project too far into the future. I think it's fair to say that at some point this year, things are going to get better. And I hope that coincides. I hope that coincides with physical screenings. I'm dying for it. Not only have I not seen this film in a room with 300 people, or 1,000 people. I haven't seen this film in a room with one or two other people, right? That's crazy. And for a young filmmaker such as myself, you do miss an opportunity to do what you were hinting at, which was study the collective body language of the audience. I mean, that's it's too late for this film, but it helps you in the next film. You learn where the laughs are and where are people getting restless. That really informs your sense of rhythm and how these things play in a room. And sometimes the jokes can't be, not that there are many jokes in this film, but for instance, jokes can't be too close to each other. If people laugh, they miss the next one. And those are the things you can only get a sense about with seeing a live audience. And I just think that experience is still really valuable for us. But I'm grateful to be working with a tremendous sales team, and we are kind of charting out the rest of the year for festivals. We're hoping to just go on the road with it, so to speak, the virtual road. And at some point that'll give way to, physical screenings. And I hope that I can pop up at one of these festivals, and most importantly with my cast, because they do such tremendous work in this film. And I think it's really important for people to understand that these are real fishermen. With all the messaging that we've done about this film, it's still amazing to me that I'll read reviews that say, oh my God, I had no idea that they were actually real fishermen until I saw the credits or I saw the Q&A. And I think that's a credit to the work that they do in the film, because there are like good non-actor performances. And I think we all kind of know what those are. And then there's what, Jusmark and David do in this film, just amazing performances, and no one would be they're none the wiser that these guys had never been on camera before this film. It's tremendous.
To finish off with, I suppose, I'm keen to see what, with this the experience of making this film, do you have an idea of what you'll work on next? And if so, are you looking to do something with the same sort of approach, where it's all very, it's very grounded maybe in the community it's representing, and you'll work with folk who have not acted before or maybe haven't acted a lot before? Is that an approach you'll look to carry forward, or did you feel that was just what fitted this particular story?
Well, I mean, I really enjoyed working in this way, and I am developing my next film right now. It brings me back to Malta, and it is actually using, again, some similar techniques, but charting in a different direction. Okay. So I'm going to work again with non-actors and mixing in also some trained actors, set in a very specific side of Malta that most people don't know about, but in a completely different emotional register, different tone, different kinds of characters. And I think it's really going to surprise people.
All right. Well, fantastic. I look forward to seeing it. Hopefully in person.
I hope so too. I think it'd be actually a very good film to see with a big group of people. It has that kind of energy.
So, hello everyone. This is Betty Stojnic, coming to you not live, but pre-recorded from Croatia. So, Cinetopia is well and truly displaced and delocalized. I have recently had the privilege to cover International Film Festival Rotterdam, and would like to talk to you about it here and share some experiences and talk about some of the films that left an impression on me. IFFR, of course, is highly regarded in Europe as a festival that provides a space for really innovative cinema, often by new or relatively unknown talent, and this is particularly true of its trademark Tiger competition, which is the main selection that I will be covering today. This year's edition of IFFR was the festival's 50-year jubilee, which was unfortunately limited to online screenings and events for the time being. Fret not, though, because the festival will be back early June this year with physical events and a special anniversary program. Another interesting thing about this year's edition of IFFR is that it's the first under its new festival director, Vanja Kalojecic, who clearly had a lot of work ahead of her given the new online format. Still, I really enjoyed the festival myself, and I'm really happy to have been able to watch so many of the films. One of the perks of doing this online is that you can kind of just sit at home and stack like 4 films to watch one after the other before you've even had dinner, so I actually got to watch more stuff than I expected. Like I said, what I'd really like to focus on is the Tiger competition, which is dedicated to up-and-coming international filmmakers for whom this may even be their first ever foray into feature-length film. The competition was founded in 1995, and this year's edition of it included 16 films, with the jury consisting of Lemoang Jeremiah Mosese, Orvan Narabia, Hala El-Kushi, Helena van der Meulen, and Ilse Hugan. They were to decide which film receives the 40,000 euro grand prize and the 2 special jury awards at 10,000 euros each. One of the 2 special jury awards went to Icomet, A Corsican Summer by Pascal Tognati. I would primarily describe Icomet as a slice-of-life film, which depicts life on Corsica through a series of vignettes, each of which is dedicated to the characterization of the people living on the island and their relationships and families. I personally enjoyed Icomet, but because of its episodic nature, I did feel like some of the storylines and character arcs were more interesting than others. The second winner of the special jury award was Looking for Venera by Norika Sefa, which is a coming-of-age story set against the backdrop of a small Kosovo town. Venera, the protagonist, is a teenage girl living in a multi-generational household with her restrictive and domineering parents. As she begins to explore teenagehood, Venera needs to learn how to be both independent from her parents and from the expectations of her own peers. I quite liked Looking for Venera. I think it was a rather conventional coming-of-age film, but I do think the setting gives it a very unique context of living in a community that is experiencing a gradual generational shift in terms of its traditions and values. Finally, the winner of the main Tiger Award was Pebbles by Indian director Vinothraj P.S. Pebbles follows a young boy as he wanders with his alcoholic father between villages in the hot, desolate outskirts in southern India.
சின்ன கூதி உள்ள உன் குண்டி திமிர இன்னைக்கு இறக்குறா இல்லன்னு பாடுறா எல்லாம் அதான் சொல்லி விட்ட படம்னா
The relationship between father and son is kept tacit. The whole film is quite minimalist in its approach, and they embark on this short journey in a vividly hot and dry environment. I think it's precisely the environment of this film that likely got it the award, as it's quite unique, but also portrayed in a really visually masterful way, where the viewer is simultaneously aware of every crack in the ground, but also the totality of the image as this great big stretch of dry land and rock. Aside from the award winners, there are some other highlights that I'd like to mention. One of them is Chinese director Queen Elise Bipolar, which is a road movie about a young girl who rescues a presumed holy lobster from its display tank in a Tibetan hotel. Bipolar is the filmmaker's first feature film, and while it's pretty typical in its story beats and tone for a road movie, I honestly think it's a remarkable achievement for a debut film. The cinematography is excellent, and I really appreciated the emotional sincerity of it. I also wanted to briefly mention Marta Popivoda's Landscapes of Resistance, a documentary in the form of an extended interview with Sonia, who was one of the Yugoslav partisan movement's first female fighters and an Auschwitz survivor. I'm obviously from the former Yugoslavia as well, so this was a really moving and insightful look into what I consider the area's joint history and a really inspiring film for contemporary anti-fascists. Overall, I think the selection was really interesting, mainly because it was so focused on the places and communities from which these films come. I think it really made IFFR live up to the international in its name. Keep in mind, these are films that are often feature-length debuts and will have their imperfections, but I think it's a fantastic way to find out which filmmakers to keep an eye on in the future. So, those were my thoughts and recommendations for this year's IFFR. I hope all of our listeners are staying safe out there. If you'd like to read more about IFFR or find more information about the films, make sure to check out Cinetopia's blog on the topic. Once again, hello from Croatia, and now we can return to our regularly scheduled Cinetopia programming.
So that wraps up our show for this month. But never fear, we're back and in a week or so. We're as per usual. I think this is the third year in the running. I'm not sure if second or third. We are doing a Glasgow Film Festival special. So a few of the films, as you know, are going to be part of the Glasgow Film Festival, but also shortly coming out that we reviewed this week. But we're going to do a dedicated special right at the beginning of the film festival, which is coming. Starts the 24th, I believe. And I'll just let Jim give a little bit more. But we're also going to be doing interviews with directors and whatnot. So look out for that. And Jim, tell us a little bit about what we're going to be reviewing and whatnot.
Yeah, so we know a couple of the films we're talking about, but generally there are so many films we don't even know what we're going to be covering yet. I think one thing we're definitely going to talk about is Minari, which has had a lot of good press. We'll be talking about that. That debuted at the Sundance Film Festival last year, 2020, before the before times. So we'll be talking about that because that's going to be opening Glasgow Film Festival. There's also a film I saw at Toronto, Apples, Greek film, which is going to be screening at the festival. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff. I mean, I think keep an eye out on our social media to see what we're talking about. I mean, there's lots of candidates. There's Limbo, Ben Sharrock's new film, Scottish filmmaker. There's Black Bear, another one from Sundance last year. City Hall, new Frederick Wiseman documentary. Some or all of these we may end up talking about, but basically we'll be trying to pick out some stuff from the Glasgow programme, talk about it, and hopefully we'll be doing some interviews with folk as well, where we can get into the weeds on some of these things. But yeah, we're gonna do a dedicated show for the Glasgow Film Festival. A week from when this one goes out, so we're going to publish it on the 23rd, which is the day before the film festival starts.
Great, so you'll be hearing from us soon. So that's it for this one, but see you in a week.